Okay, can you see my screen, my slides?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to talk about MIM or Abracadabra or Spell and like the entire ecosystem around that. And I think this is a nice project to talk about because from the previous discussions we've had, we've spoken about Convex, we've spoken about MIM indirectly, we've spoken about Lido now, and this project kind of brings a few of these pieces together. So yeah, it should be interesting to see what we can get out of this. So firstly, what is MIM? So MIM is a cross-chain stablecoin protocol, and it's on a bunch of networks, which is pretty cool. That does give us opportunity in the future to move to other chains. Functionally, it's like a single-sided or isolated money market based off of Sushi's Kashi protocol that lets you borrow MIM against collateral currencies. And what's unique about MIM is that you can use more exotic kinds of collateral types that are actually interest-bearing tokens. So the flow is basically you deposit your collateral into Abracadabra. You get a debt allocation, which you can use as collateral in a loan. And against that, you can borrow MIM tokens. And then you can do with those MIM tokens whatever you'd like. And we'll get into what you can do with them later on, which is where this becomes somewhat interesting. So under the hood, like I mentioned, it uses Kashi, which is SushiSwap's isolated lending market. And what's really cool about this lending market is that it provides isolation in risk between different assets. So like one of the big issues with Compound, for example, and the reason why Compound has so few assets listed on it is that the pool security is only as safe as the weakest asset in the pool. So it's quite easy if one of the assets is compromised to steal all the money from all the other tokens within the money market in the Compound style money market. So like Cream V1 had this exact same problem, and like some of the hacks, not the most recent ones, but previous ones were vulnerable to this kind of attack where basically if you can control one of the tokens in the money market, you can mint an infinite amount of that, supply it to the money market and steal the other currencies. Obviously there are restrictions that are put in place, but in any case, isolated money markets are safer. And they also enable like more dynamic interest rates based on those specific pairs. So you can think of it rather than having like a pool of bunch of different liquidities or different assets as liquidity being used as something that you borrow against one asset. Instead of like that pooled model, you have like a one-to-one market where you'll have like one collateral borrowed against one other token. So I think that's important to consider with the risk, because when people look at MIM, they often like feel like it's unsafe due to like the auditing and that kind of thing. But I think this isolated money market mechanism under the hood makes it quite a bit safer. So like I mentioned earlier, what really makes MIM unique is the fact that it supports very interesting collateral currencies. So I've got a list here of the collateral currencies that are on ETH-L1. All the other layer 2s and side chains and other places where MIM is deployed have different currencies, but for now we're going to focus on Ethereum because that's where we started with Aladdin, and we can spread out later on down the line. And what's important to note in this list is these ones. I think these are the ones that we should focus on to begin with. So what these collaterals are yearns, interest-bearing collateral types, which you can then put into a money market. So you can get, so YV WETH and YV CRV ST-ETH, those are interest-bearing ETH positions in Yearn Finance, which you can then use as collateral. So what Nick just spoke about with staked ETH, this currency here is literally that, right? So you can use that 5% yielding or 5 to 10, depending on the rate at any point in time, interest-bearing ETH as a collateral and borrow stable coins against that. And that's where this becomes very different to other kinds of money markets, in that your collateral can actually be very highly interest-bearing. And equally, you can use interest-bearing stable coins to borrow other stable coins, which is a weird concept. So you can use USDC, interest-bearing USDC as collateral to borrow MIM. And then we'll get into what you could do with it later, but you could in theory buy more USDC, put it back into Yearn, and then rinse and repeat, and effectively lever up on your stables and getting interest on both Yearn and in MIM. And remember that Yearn is like in and of itself wrapping a whole bunch of protocols all the way down the stack, right? Like that's probably got curve in it somewhere, depending on the protocol. It probably has other incentives down the line. And then the other ones that are interesting to look at here, I think, are staked spell, wrapped ohm, and X sushi. So these are like more on the degenerate side of ways that you can use MIM. In particular, the ohm one, which we'll look at a bit later. But I think this is very interesting because if a project is already long one of these other projects, like if you're bullish on sushi and you're earning a yield on X sushi, you can further compound that yield by borrowing stables against that and then putting those into money markets or even buying more sushi. One of the downsides with the isolated pools, though, is that there's a limitation on how much MIM can be borrowed against any one collateral type. And this is a bit of a problem because it means that like once that limit has been hit, like no additional MIM can be borrowed until more MIM is put into the AMM. And that requires like a whole governance action. And it's like quite complicated around how additional MIM gets in. So this is like the major limitation right now. Like I think most of the pools on ETH L1 are full, but in any case, there are a few that are not, and there are many pools on other chains that are not full. So the question that I alluded to earlier on is like, what do we do with this MIM, right? So let's say we've taken Nick's staked ETH, we've put it into Abracadabra, we've borrowed MIM. So what do we do with it? So the first thing is to go and get stable yield. And what's really great about stable yield is you're not taking on any price exposure with the debt that you've created. So you've got a collateralized deposition that you've borrowed against, and that collateral, or sorry, that debt, this stable coin, this MIM, you then put into a yield farm and earn yield on that. And you're not directly taking on any price risk on what you've borrowed. So there are two main pools on Convex right now that are pretty good. There's just the straight up MIM pool, and I think that's pooled MIM against USDC, USDT, and I'm not sure what the third, or there's another coin in that, I think, and that's around 25%. It was 50% a few weeks ago. These tend to be somewhat volatile, but they always are like some of the highest stable pools. And then there's a MIM UST pool, which is quite new, and that's earning like crazy yields on stable coins, like that you can get 50% on, or close to 50 on a USD denominated stable coin farm is always like a pretty hectic thing. So there are obviously risks with doing the stable farming. So if the MIM that you've borrowed is like an asset that's volatile, such as ETH, you need to consider that you can get liquidated and that you need to manage your margin in that position. So when I do this on my own personal yield farming, I'm very conservative on how much I borrow. Like I tend to not want to be more than like 30 or 40% utilized on the position. So I can sleep at night knowing that, you know, even if ETH shits the bed really badly, something bad happens, like I'm not going to get liquidated overnight. I might need to unwind my position in the morning, but I should be safe. And I think different people are going to have different risk tolerances. And obviously, if it's a DAO that's investing or a DAO that's investing on behalf of other people, that risk needs to be considered. And maybe you avoid those higher risk positions. But yeah, so that is a risk to consider. If the collateral is a stable coin, then obviously you can push the utilization way up higher, because then the liquidation would happen in the event that one of the stable coins breaks the peg. But yeah, I think just to reemphasize what I said earlier, the important detail with this particular strategy is that the MIM, you're not taking on MIM price risk because it's a stable coin. So like if the price of ETH starts falling, what you do is you simply withdraw from Convex and repay your MIM debt, right? So you can always unwind the position, basically. Then there's this other idea where you can be a bit more degenerate that I mentioned earlier. And we've seen a lot of people in OHM do this, where basically you buy OHM, you stake your OHM, you get your 7,000 or 8,000% APY in staked OHM. Then you wrap your OHM into wrapped staked OHM. And then you put that wrapped stake OHM into MIM, against which you borrow some magic internet money. It is now really magic internet money. And you use that to buy more OHM, and you repeat the cycle a few times. Now, this is obviously incredibly dangerous, and I wouldn't recommend anyone, like, unless you are very confident in the price action of the underlying asset, doing this. And yeah, we've also, if you look at like the price chart of OHM on any of these decentralized exchanges, you'll see there's like this wicking action in the most recent crashes. And a lot of that is due to like the flash liquidations that are happening when large positions that have done this wrapping leveraging, rewrapping thing have been liquidated. But I do think that there is something to be learned from this particular strategy that is perhaps less degenerate, where you could buy ETH, stake ETH, wrap it, borrow MIM, buy a little bit more ETH while still managing your margin. So I think that's an option. So we've gotten this whole way through this discussion. We haven't spoken about Spell. So Spell is the governance token in Abracadabra. And as you can see, its price action has been quite extraordinary over the last short period. It's taken a bit of a dip on the last couple of days, but nothing too bad, I don't think. So the distribution of Spell, the vast majority has been allocated for farming incentives. And this is going into those convex bribes that Nick was mentioning earlier on, predominantly, almost exclusively, I think. And that's to actually facilitate the yields that we saw over here, right? The reason these yields are so high is because of those Spell bribes at the end of the day. And we can actually see that when we look at the gauge weights on Curve, and we can see that, you know, like a large percentage of all of the gauge weight is allocated to MIM. And that is a direct result of that, we have such high APYs. So at the end of the day, this is somewhat circular, right? Like the APY is high because Spell has a high price, and Spell having a high price makes the APY go up, which means that they can bribe more, right? So it's like kind of circular, and as with a lot of these protocols, but at least for now, you know, that circular behavior is being advantageous for people involved. It might come crumbling down, and then we'll see this weight shrink. But I think that a lot of that would be similar with all the other protocols if we were to enter into some kind of bear market. So staked Spell is important to understand. So you can convert your Spell into staked Spell and capture protocol revenue. This is exactly the same as how XSushi works, where in XSushi, like swap fees are like 0.25% and 0.05% goes to XSushi holders, plus like fees from Kashi and all these other things. Same kind of idea in staked Spell, where you get interest from the money markets, and you get percentages of the liquidations and additional revenue generated from other sources. And that's currently like 23%, which is pretty good, given that you can then use that staked Spell to go do other things. And I think in the future, I'm not exactly sure how decentralized it is now, but in the future, you can use the staked Spell to participate in the MIM governance. So there are some other things that the MIM ecosystem has that we haven't directly spoken about. So they have this cross-chain bridge, which is very interesting. And they can use a lot of the fact that they control the supply and the minting capabilities of MIM and Spell to create bridges across all the chains that they're on. And more broadly, not like in the MIM ecosystem, but adjacent are projects like ICE, which I would recommend you look into if you found MIM interesting. ICE is also pretty cool. Excuse the pun. So there are 4 main strategies that we might be able to take advantage of, or that anyone who's interested in this idea of like leveraged yield-bearing collateralized loans can do. So the first one is, if you're bullish on ETH, would be like the least risky bullish ETH position would be to supply ETH on Yearn and to get Yearn Curve staked ETH. So that's Nick's strategy that he described before. You then take that position and you use it as collateral to borrow MIM, and you use that MIM to buy more ETH and deposit back into a cycle. That last step could be ignored. And if you don't want to risk on more, you just take the ETH, you just take the stables and put them into a money market like Convex. It's not a money market, but you put them into a yield opportunity like Convex. And that's similar to what the second strategy is, which is the risk neutral strategy. So if you already have a lot of stable coins, you can then supply those to Yearn and then use that as collateral to borrow MIM and then deposit MIM into Convex and farm additional rewards. And I think obviously there's a middle ground between the two of these strategies that I mentioned, where you just borrow against your ETH or your other assets and just put those stables into Convex. And in doing so, like I mentioned earlier, like you haven't actually taken on price risk. So you can always like unwind that position. Like there's margin risk, you can get liquidated, but the thing that you've borrowed you haven't like traded that away. So you can always unwind the position. And then if you're bullish on spell, you can farm it or buy it and then get staked spell and then use that to borrow MIM and do other things with it. You could use the risk neutral strategy or use like a bullish strategy where you buy more spell, but I would think that that's probably not a great idea. And then lastly, you can LP spell and ETH on Sushi, and those have pretty good yields on both Ethereum L1 and on Arbitrum. So just as a future point, if Aladdin was to go cross-chain, MIM is already there on most of the chains it would want to go to. So it's an easy win to be able to have a product there already, which I think is a big plus. And you can also, once you've gone cross-chain, often there's these like mispricing between chains within the same protocol where you might be able to supply assets on one chain and then borrow on that chain, bridge over the MIM onto another chain, and then farm on the second chain. So taking advantage of where it is the cheapest to borrow and lend, or borrow and supply assets into another protocol. Obviously, managing your risk becomes more difficult now because unwinding it is a multi-step process across multiple chains, but nevertheless, there is a strategy there which can get quite sophisticated. And yeah, that's the end of my slides. So I think that this project is probably what's interesting about it and somewhat different to some of the ones we've discussed before is that there is like a wide range of degeneracy of how far you want to take this thing, right? Like whether or not you want it to be like just a simple thing where you are, you're really long ETH and you're trying to gain a little bit more yield, or you want to like go full ham and lever up on ohm, right? That's quite nice that there's like a wide range of things that we can do with it. And that will suit like many different risk tolerances and profiles.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's yeah, I think an awesome overview of this project, basically. And I have one question, more technical. So why has it the limit on MIM? Is it just the pools are limited on the MIM they can generate, and then you have to adjust it? So why is it the case? It's just governments.
Yeah, I think this is due to the Kashi market that MIM is built on. So if you go on Kashi, like SushiSwap, sushi.com/lend or borrow this URL, you'll see like the same behavior on all of their money markets where because they're isolated, you can't like additional supply on one market doesn't allow you to borrow more on another market. So it's due to that there's limitations. Like there's only so much in each particular Kashi market that can be borrowed. I didn't find a huge amount of detail on how additional MIM is created, but my understanding is that it's governed by a multi-sig, and then additional Kashi markets are then funded with that MIM. But I'm sure someone else on this call knows more about that than I do, and I would love to learn for my own knowledge as well if anyone else knows. But I think that's how that additional MIM comes into circulation.
Okay. Yeah, the thing is, what I understand, but somehow I don't see. Of course, now we have isolated markets. So if one market gets hacked or however you name it, or the liquidation process is not working, then the pool itself loses like value basically. But if you take it, so but this means on the other side, all these pool together, they generate a certain amount of MIM. So if one of these isolated pool is hacked, the MIM is somehow undercollateralized too, because then the value somehow that's what.
Yeah.
It's just I don't know how. In a way, then if this would happen, then every other pools have to take a haircut or something like this. And I think in a regional lending market, this is not the case.
Right. So the way that one of these pools could get hacked, or like what could go wrong, is like the absolute worst case is like all the pools break and you can drain the funds from all of them. Right. That's like everything's fucked. The marginally better scenario is one of these tokens breaks. Right. So like staked ETH breaks and enables someone to mint a lot of it. Right. That's the failure mode where the isolation protects you. So what'll happen then is I take my new staked ETH and I can then borrow all the MIM that's in that particular Kashi market, and then I can sell it, right? So in that case, you are right that there is like a notion of a haircut that's applied to all borrowers and all lenders, like the whole system, but it's limited to the maximum amount that can be borrowed in that particular pool. And that's why there are these limitations, because that effectively protects, like there's a lot of pools, right? There's like 20 on Ethereum and a bunch on other chains. And I suspected that if that was to happen, people will just arbit. Like I borrow against MIM, and if I see MIM is at a discount, I'm going to buy it at a discount and use that to repay my loan, right? Which is like the core mechanism that keeps MIM stable. I think will mean that in the event of one of the pools breaking, it will remain stable, assuming it's not like, you know, like 60% of the pools have been broken. So if it's like isolated and it's like 5% of the total MIM that can be borrowed, then I think that it would be fine.
Okay. Yeah, other questions or additions?
So Chris, when you need to run liquidations on MIM, right? When you need to liquidate these farming assets, so do they actually unwind it to native assets?
I think that's up to the liquidator to do. They're going to be effectively buying bad debt from the protocol in exchange. So they're going to be putting in, they're going to be paying back the debt. So they're paying MIM, and in exchange, they're going to get collateral at a discounted value. And that exchange rate will be like equal to whatever the implicit value of that collateral is, minus some discount factor to incentivize the liquidator. Whether or not they then choose to unwind it and take it all the way back to ETH, if it's staked ETH, I don't know. I think that's up to them. And like I've seen with a lot of these protocols that have like weird collateral types, that often can be like difficult. So the liquidator might choose to hold on to that asset, or it all depends on what their like portfolio management strategy is. Like if they want to go back into stables, then they'll probably try and unwind it and sell. Or maybe there's an AMM already for that collateral. I think that'll very much depend on the liquidator's particular strategy.
Okay, I understand. And so for Aladdin to integrate this strategy, right? Say on the bullish ETH strategy, you know, the users actually doesn't get incentive to create MIM, right? And so probably we should get the users to stake like a Y-earn LP position with us directly, and then we do the backend arbitrage between the yields and the funding cost of MIM.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You would want to take the Yearn ETH position and use that as collateral to borrow against, and then like manage. Like if you're doing this in size, then you would obviously want to have like automated techniques for unwinding that position. So maybe, you know, Aladdin DAO wouldn't be comfortable with anything that's more than 200% collateralized, right? So as soon as it drops to 190, then you withdraw some of the MIM from Curve and you pay back the debt in Abracadabra. So yeah, but that's like separate to the liquidation, right? So, but yeah, from a user's perspective, I think depositing Curve ETH would make the most sense, but they could equally deposit ETH and then you zap into Yearn ETH or whatever. Like you can abstract it away from the user. It just becomes more and more expensive, right, due to gas. But I think there are ways to amortize that as well, where you could like gather up a batch of ETH and then do it at once and things like this.
Right, and with the collateral ratio, right, and also the spread between the yield and the funding cost, probably we can do that for 2 to 3 rounds. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also something where you don't have to do like everything at once, right? Like you can build up to these strategies. That idea of like supplying Yearn ETH and then borrowing a stable against it, like this is very similar to what Curve's original ETH strategy, or yeah, each strategy did, where they would like create a CDP with curve, sorry, not curve, with yearn, so many weird similar words. Yearn, users would deposit ETH, they would create a CDP, borrow DAI against that, and then use that DAI to farm on curve, and then manage the risk around that like large position that all yearn holders would have, like algorithmically, depending on what this collateral ratio is. And you could program a smart contract where it could calculate, like, my collateral ratio is X and I want it to be Y, therefore I need to perform the following action. Kind of like DeFi saver, but for like a whole pool of depositors, and anyone can like initiate the rebalancing by just like poking the contract, and then it checks what its health is.
Yep, understood. That's very helpful.
Hey, Chris, one thing I might have missed is where is the like there's like a tool on Abracadabra Money that you can like wind up a stablecoin position, or am I confusing that with something else?
That's right. I just ignored that because it's currently full. So
It is.
like
Okay.
you would,
What is that normally under? I don't know. I was trying to look this up as you were talking about it, and I'm not sure that that's an ideal strategy either. What I just mentioned is probably not ideal for a Latin DAO, but it was interesting to me because leveraged stablecoin positions are, I would argue they're relatively safer to use, but there is obviously that risk of liquidation that we probably wouldn't want to expose Aladdin DAO members to.
yeah. So I'm, it's not loading on my side, but I remember it being under the borrowed tab. It might be somewhere else, but
they probably hit it just because it's unavailable. But yeah, well, great presentation. I have not been very involved in Abracadabra, just played with it a bit, and been really like impressed by obviously the growth of it. And yeah, this is awesome, man. This is part of the reason I love coming to this call, is getting a deep dive on something I've heard about but haven't been able to dig into.
Thanks. I think here's actually that thing that you were referring to, where you can add leverage.
There we go.
But you know, the problem is, if we look here on this page, the borrowable about amount of MIM is like $21. So you, on that particular pool, that's basically full. But
Yeah,
I mean, there are other pools that have like quite a considerable amount of liquidity. And there are other pools on other chains that also have liquidity. So like, actually, like, look, for example, here, right? There's a fair amount of liquidity here. 46 million MIM can be borrowed here against this WETH contract, the WETH collateral. So yeah, it's like, it's all dependent on like how much is available at that point in time, which is I think probably the biggest downside to the strategy.
Yeah. If Abracadabra has done so well that this could be one where we would actually want to deploy a strategy, but the liquidity isn't there, and that's probably one of the main things that might force us to have to wait on this. But otherwise, I think it checks off a lot of the boxes. What you were showing, especially if we go a more conservative strategy here that's stablecoin based and sort of avoids any sort of like any sort of like higher leverage. But this is awesome, man. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't have to add anything. Thank you for your presentations. Yeah, great insight and very detailed information about Spell. Yeah, I guess because also we hit the hour, I would have some more questions, but because we hit the hour, I will close the call, and thank you for joining. What we are looking for, we look for somebody to present next week on the side from René, who is presenting next week. We look for a second person who didn't present until now. I know, please contact me if you are somebody's in the call who didn't present and has an idea what to present. Please write me a message right away, and then I will book you for the next week. Thank you very much. So see you at the latest next week and otherwise on Discord. Bye. Thank you for joining.
You guys.
Thanks,
Ciao.
Thank you
Martin.
guys.
Great
Great
Thanks.
presentations.
Great job, everyone.